On the morning of August 27, 1776, General James Grant had every reason to believe the day belonged to him. His column was pushing up the Gowanus Road on the western end of Long Island, part of a British and Hessian force that numbered close to 20,000 men, the largest army the British Empire had ever sent across an ocean. In front of him stood a few thousand American amateurs, farmers and shopkeepers in homespun and hunting shirts, the kind of men Grant had once assured Parliament could never stand against British regulars. He expected them to break the moment the bayonets came level. Most of them did, but a few hundred of them did not. And what those few hundred men chose to do over the next several hours would cost most of them their lives, and would quietly decide whether the American Revolution lasted another month or another 7 years. By the time the sun went down, more than half of them would be dead or in British hands. The army they threw themselves in front of, the whole surviving corps of Washington's command, would slip backward through the mud and the dark and live to fight another day. That was the trade they made, their lives for the army's escape, and it worked. To understand why that trade even had to be offered, you have to understand how badly the war was going. It was the summer of 1776. The ink on the Declaration of Independence was barely dry, and the men who had signed it were watching a British fleet the size of a floating city crowd into New York Harbor. Hundreds of ships, thousands of professional soldiers, the full weight of the world's dominant empire arriving to strangle the rebellion in its first year. The news from elsewhere was worse. The American invasion of Canada had collapsed into a nightmare, an army staggering home broken and hollowed out by smallpox. Its best general dead in the snow outside Quebec. The cause was not winning. The cause looked to any sober observer like it was already lost. Into that gap stepped a strange and unlikely set of men. Their commander on this part of the field was William Alexander, though almost everyone called him Lord Stirling because he had crossed an ocean to press a claim to a lapsed Scottish earldom and, title or not, insisted on the name for the rest of his life. He was wealthy, he had every reason to sit the war out on the comfortable side. Instead, he had thrown his fortune and his person in with the rebels, and he fought by every account like a man with something to prove. Under him were the Marylanders. The 1st Maryland Regiment had been raised largely from Baltimore's better families, young men who came to the army well-drilled, well-dressed, and taken more seriously than most of the ragged Continental line. On this day, their own colonel was absent, and they were led into the fight by a Baltimore merchant-turned-soldier named Mordecai. These were not hard-bitten frontiersmen. Many of them were the sons of Maryland's merchants and planters, young men of family and fortune who had turned out in fine coats, better equipped and better drilled than almost anyone else in the army, carrying themselves with a polish that drew admiration from some of the ragged regiments around them and a quiet smirk from others. It would have been easy to look at them and see parade ground soldiers, men who had never been asked to do anything harder than march in a straight line and look good doing it. History has a grim sense of irony. Of every unit standing on that field, it would be these well-dressed gentlemen from Baltimore who were handed the ugliest, most thankless task of the entire day, and who would carry it out almost to the last man. Remember these men and the ground they held? Because everything that saved Washington's army turned on it, and across the field from them was Grant, the embodiment of everything the Americans were up against. Years earlier, standing in the House of Commons, he had reportedly scoffed that the colonists were no soldiers at all, that with a handful of regiments, he could march from one end of the continent to the other. He believed it. Most of the British command believed it. They had spent the morning being proven right, watching green troops give way exactly as predicted. That certainty, earned, reasonable, and about to be catastrophically misplaced, was the thing the Maryland men were about to walk straight into. To see what the Maryland men were about to sacrifice themselves for, you first have to see the board the way the generals saw it that August, because the position Washington had chosen was, on its surface, close to indefensible. He had put a wing of his army forward, out on a long wooded ridge called the Heights of Gowanus, well ahead of the fortified lines dug in on Brooklyn Heights behind them. To many eyes then and since, it looked reckless to the point of madness. Thousands of men pushed out in front of their own defenses with a river at their backs, and no easy way home. But there was a logic to it, and the logic had a name. It was called Bunker Hill. A year earlier, on ground much like this, dug-in Americans had made British regulars pay a butcher's bill for every yard of high ground. Washington's bet was that these wooded ridges could do the same, that the British would have to climb into American muskets and bleed for it. He knew exactly how thin the margin was. In his orders to the army that week, he told them plainly that the fate of millions yet unborn now rested on the courage and conduct of the men standing on this ground. He was not exaggerating for effect, he believed it. The ridge could only be crossed in a few places. 4 narrow passes cut through the high wooded ground. On the western end, near the shore, ran the coast road where Grant was pressing forward against Stirling and the Marylanders. In the center sat the Flatbush Pass, held against the Hessians under General von Heister. A third pass covered the middle left, and far out on the eastern end, on the extreme American left, was the Jamaica Pass. Now pay close attention to that last one, because it is the hinge the entire battle swings on. The Jamaica Pass, the door on the far end of the American line, was guarded by exactly 5 young mounted officers. 5 men. That was the whole watch on the one road that led around the army's flank. And it was not as though no one had seen the danger. Out on that end of the line, a Pennsylvania colonel named Samuel Miles had grown uneasy about the open road to the east and tried on his own initiative to swing his riflemen over to cover it. He was too late and too few. He rode straight into the side of a marching army and was swallowed by it, captured along with much of his command before he could get a warning back to anyone who could act on it. The door had been left open, and the men who noticed were the ones who paid for it first. The British had found that door. On the night of August 26th, while Grant kept up his noisy pressure on the coast to hold American eyes to the west, the bulk of the British army, close to 10,000 men under Howe, Clinton, and Cornwallis, slipped quietly east in the dark. Local loyalist farmers who knew every cart path guided the column through the night. They reached the Jamaica Pass, scooped up the 5 officers before a single warning could be fired, and poured through. It was, from the British side, exactly the kind of audacious plan that looks insane until it works. Marching an entire army on a night flank march through unfamiliar country, gambling everything on surprise. It worked perfectly. Near 9 in the morning, with the flank column finally in position behind the American line, signal guns thudded across the fields. That was the cue. Grant stopped merely pressing and drove forward in earnest. The Hessians surged up out of the center pass, and the hammer came down from behind. In a single coordinated instant, the men holding the passes found themselves with an enemy in front and an enemy at their backs, and no one had told them it was coming. That was the trap. Grant in front, von Heister in the center, and the jaws closing from the rear, exactly where 5 men had been asked to hold an open road. The forward American wing wasn't about to fight a battle. It was about to be swallowed whole, unless something slowed the closing jaws long enough for those thousands of men to run. From the British side, the morning had the feel of a victory already won. The flank attack landed exactly as designed. The American center buckled, then broke. General Sullivan's men, caught between 2 fires, dissolved into a running mass of individuals trying to reach the safety of the Brooklyn lines. Sullivan himself was taken. To Grant, to Cornwallis, to every officer riding forward through the smoke, this was simply the thing they had always been told would happen. The amateurs were running. All that remained was to close the last door before the rats got through it. That last door was a crossing over Gowanus Creek, stretch of tidal marsh fed by a mill dam, an 80-yard belt of chest-deep water and sucking mud that lay between the collapsing American right and the fortifications behind. Guarding the road to it now was a squat Dutch farmhouse of thick stone walls, the Vechte Corteliu house, which Cornwallis had seized and packed with troops. And these were not ordinary troops. The men holding that house and the ground around it were the sharp edge of Howe's army, British grenadiers, the biggest and most feared soldiers in each regiment, and kilted Scottish Highlanders with a reputation earned on battlefields across Europe. Hold that house, command that road, and the thousands of Americans still trapped on the wrong side of the creek would have nowhere left to run. The British believed the hard part was over. That belief was the mistake, because on the far right, Lord Stirling had finally understood what had happened behind him. He had spent the morning trading fire with Grant, holding his ground, doing exactly what he'd been asked to do. And in doing it so well, He had nearly gotten himself and his men encircled. Now he could see the stone house in enemy hands, the road cut, the creek at his back. Most commanders in that position surrender. Stirling did the arithmetic differently. He could not save everyone, but he could buy time. He ordered the bulk of his command to break for the creek and get across however they could, wade it, swim it, drown trying, and to keep the British off them while they ran. He took a few hundred of the Maryland men and turned them around, back toward the one enemy strong point that mattered, and attacked it. Roughly 400 men, against the elite of the British army, dug into a stone house. What came at the grenadiers out of the smoke was not a rout. It is a line of men in good order, walking into a position that should have shredded them, and it does not stop when it is supposed to. They hit the house and were thrown back. They reformed in the open, under fire, and came again. Again they were driven off. Again they closed ranks and charged. Something like half a dozen times the Marylanders went at that house, and the troops around it, Stirling and Gist leading them in person, pressing so hard that twice they nearly took the position outright, close enough that Cornwallis had to feed in reinforcements to hold ground he thought he already owned. And behind them, it was working. While the 400 died in the open field, the men Stirling had sent for the creek were fighting the water instead of the British, wading into the tidal marsh chest deep with their muskets held overhead, floundering across the mill pond in the mud, some cut down in the shallows. A few swept under and drowned, but most of them came up on the far bank alive. Every minute the Maryland men kept Cornwallis fighting was another few dozen soldiers who reached the Brooklyn lines instead of a prison hulk in the harbor. From a redoubt across the water, George Washington watched it happen. He could see the whole shape of it, the stand, the sacrifice, what it was costing and what it was buying, and he was close enough to grasp exactly which men were being spent. He is said to have wrung his hands and cried out that God, what brave fellows he was losing that day. He could not stop it. He could only watch it work. It could not last. And it did not. The charges finally gutted out as the survivors were surrounded and overwhelmed. Stirling, refusing to the end to hand his sword to the British he had been fighting all morning, walked instead to the Hessian commander von Heister and surrendered to him. Of the roughly 400 Marylanders who had turned and charged, only a small remnant ever reached the American lines. By the oldest count, the man who led them out, Mordecai Gist, came back with 9. 9, the dead were later tallied at more than 250, though even now historians argue over the exact figure. It is the kind of casualty return that reads like something invented for effect, an entire regiment of a young country's best drilled troops spending itself almost to the last man in a single afternoon and doing it on purpose. So it is worth stopping to name exactly what those men did, because it was not what it looked like. They did not win the Battle of Brooklyn. They were never trying to. They did not break the British line, or turn the day, or pull off some miracle that flipped defeat into victory. They did something harder to see, and in the end, more important. They traded ground they could never hold for time the army could not buy any other way. They turned a rout into a rear guard. They turned their own destruction into a door held open. And they turned the worst single day of the war into the reason there was still a war left to fight, because the stand bought that afternoon. But the danger was not over when the guns went quiet. Washington's entire command, what was left of it, was now packed into the fortified lines on Brooklyn Heights with the wide East River at its back. Howe, who had watched British regulars bleed to death charging uphill at Bunker Hill, chose not to storm the works. He would dig in and take them by siege instead, sapping forward a yard at a time. It was the safe choice, and it was slow. And that slowness was the second gift the day had given the Americans. Because all that stood between Washington's trapped army and total destruction was a single stretch of river. And the only thing keeping the Royal Navy from sailing up that river to seal the trap was the wind, which for 2 critical days blew hard out of the northeast and pinned the British ships where they lay. Washington read the board and made his decision. On the night of August 29th, in silence, his army began to disappear. Regiment by regiment, the men were pulled quietly off the line and marched down to the water, while those left behind kept the campfires burning and made enough noise for an army that was no longer there. Waiting at the ferry landing were the men of Marblehead, Massachusetts, John Glover's regiment of fishermen and sailors, men who had spent their lives on cold water, and through the whole black night they rowed, back and forth across a mile of river, boat after boat, ferrying 9,000 soldiers, their cannon, their horses, and their supplies toward Manhattan. muffled and unhurried and exact. When dawn came too soon and threatened to expose the men still waiting on the Brooklyn shore, a heavy fog rolled up off the water and hid them, holding just long enough for the last boats, Washington himself said to be among the final few to leave, to reach the far side. The British woke to find the lines in front of them empty. An entire army had vanished overnight. That was the army the Maryland men had died to keep intact, the same army that would recross a different river months later to fall on Trenton and stand at Yorktown at the end of it all. None of that happens if this force is destroyed on Long Island in the summer of 1776, and it very nearly was. Today, the Vesta Cortelyou house, the old stone house the Marylanders charged again and again, still stands, rebuilt from its own scattered stones, on a quiet patch of Brooklyn hemmed in by row houses and traffic. Not far away in Prospect Park, a monument marks the men who fought here. But the 400 themselves have no grave anyone can visit. They are believed to lie somewhere beneath the surrounding streets in a mass burial that has never been found. Maryland has never entirely forgotten them. The state still carries the nickname earned by that hard-used line of soldiers. But the truest monument is the one you can't see, a country that got to keep existing because 400 men agreed to stop running and turn around. If this story moved you, subscribe. This channel is built on exactly these moments, the ones the textbooks compress into a single sentence. Give it a like so more people find the Maryland 400. And tell me in the comments, if you had been standing on that field with the creek at your back, do you run for the water or do you turn and charge the stone house? I genuinely want to know.